Hello Year 12s and welcome to this video on Parliament and lawmaking. In this video we will be looking at the process used by Parliament to make laws, the roles of the Houses of Parliament and the Crown in lawmaking, and how the composition of the Houses of Parliament can affect the ability of Parliament to make law. There are three things that you need to do while you're watching this video. The first thing is to take the very best Cornell notes that you can. The second thing is to use the pause and rewind functions. Use the pause function if you need to stop this video to give yourself time to take some notes. Use the rewind function if you feel that you've missed out on any information and you want to go back over that information. The third thing that you need to do is have your vocabulary sheets open in front of you so that you can write into your vocabulary sheets the definitions of any important terms referred to in this video or the meaning of any other words that you may not be familiar with. When you've finished watching this video, please make sure that you read the pages from the textbook referred to in this video. And if you find any additional information in that reading that you think is useful, then include that additional information in your Cornell notes. Let's get started then. The first part of this video is about the process that Parliament uses to make laws. So your first learning intention is that you need to be able to describe the process used by Parliament to make laws. Make sure that you write this learning intention in your Cornell notes. A bill must pass through a number of stages in Parliament before it can become a law. I'll set out all of these stages on this slide. The first stage in the passage of a bill through Parliament is the first reading. This is where the bill or proposed law is introduced into the first house. Now, bills are typically introduced by the government into the lower house of Parliament. For the Commonwealth Parliament, this is the House of Representatives, and for the Victorian Parliament, this is the Legislative Assembly. The reason for this is that the government has the majority of members in the lower house. Because the government has the majority of members, and therefore the majority of votes, in the lower house, the government can be sure that the bill will be passed by the lower house. In contrast, it's increasingly the case that governments do not have the majority of members in the upper house, that is, in the Senate, in the case of the Commonwealth Parliament, or in the Legislative Council, in the case of the Victorian Parliament. This means that it can be more difficult for the government to have its bills passed by the upper house. Now, in the first reading, the responsible minister gives notice of intention to introduce the bill, reads the title of the bill, and moves that the bill be read a first time. There is no debate, that is, there's no discussion about the bill. This stage is a very short stage and can be completed in a few minutes. Copies of the bill are also circulated to all members of the House. The minister who is responsible for a bill will be the minister whose department deals with the matters that are covered by the bill. For example, where the bill is about education, the responsible minister will be the Minister for Education. In such a case, the Minister for Education will introduce the bill into Parliament in the first reading. If the majority of members of the House vote in favour of the bill being read a first time, then the bill proceeds to the second stage. Note that even though we refer to the bill as being read, the bill is not actually read out in Parliament. The second stage in the passage of a bill through Parliament is the second reading. There are two parts to the second reading. These are the second reading speech and the second reading debate. The second reading speech is given by the responsible minister and is often made shortly after the bill passes the first reading. In the second reading speech, the responsible minister outlines the purpose of the bill and the reasons the House should pass the bill. After the second reading speech, debate is adjourned, that is postponed, to give time for members to consider the bill and to consult with the public about the bill. The second part of the second reading is the second reading debate. This debate is generally held at least 2 weeks after the second reading speech, so that members have had sufficient time to properly consider and consult on the bill. Now, during the second reading speech, the responsible minister has already given the government's reasons as to why the House should pass the bill, and so the second reading debate commences with a speech by the shadow minister. So, for example, if the bill is about education, then it will be the Shadow Minister for Education who gives this speech. In this speech, the Shadow Minister will outline the opposition's views on the bill and whether the opposition intends to vote in favour of the bill, or to propose changes to the bill, or to vote against the bill. After the Shadow Minister's speech, other members of the House, that is, members of the government, members of the opposition, and the crossbenchers, have the opportunity to explain their views on the bill. The House then votes on whether the bill should be read a second time. If the majority of members of the House vote in favour of the bill being read a second time, then the bill proceeds to the next stage. Again, if the majority of members vote in favour of the bill being read a second time, this does not mean that the bill is actually read out in Parliament. It just means that the majority of members have voted in favour of the bill proceeding to the third stage. The third stage in the passage of a bill through Parliament is the committee stage. During the committee stage, the members of the House work through the bill clause by clause. Each clause is discussed in detail, and amendments that are proposed, that is moved, by members to each clause are debated and voted on. An amendment to a clause is only made if the majority of members of the House vote in favour of that amendment. If all of the members of the House agree, then it's possible to skip the committee stage. This will generally be the case with simple bills that are unanimously supported by all of the parties that are represented in that House of Parliament. Where the bill has been amended during the committee stage, then it is this bill as amended that passes to the next stage. The fourth stage in the passage of a bill through Parliament is the third reading. During this stage, there may be further debate on the bill, and it's even possible that the members might agree to make further amendments to the bill. The members of the House then vote on the bill in its final form, that is, they vote on the bill as amended, if at all, during the committee stage and the third reading. If the majority of members vote in favour of the bill being read a third time, this does not mean that the bill is actually read out in Parliament. All it means is that the bill has been passed by that House of Parliament. But the fun hasn't ended yet. If the bill is passed by the first House in the third reading, then this whole procedure is repeated in the second House. That is, in the second House, the bill must be passed through a first reading, a second reading with a second reading speech and second reading debate, the committee stage, and a third reading. Now, one person can't be a member of both the lower house and the upper house, so the role of the responsible minister in the lower house in both the first reading and the second reading will be undertaken in the upper house by another member of the government, generally a minister who has been elected to be a member of the upper house. If the majority of members vote in favour of the bill being read a third time, then the bill is passed by the second House. Of course, it's possible that the bill will be amended by the second House in the committee stage or in the third reading. However, a bill must be passed in the same form by both Houses of Parliament before it can become a law. Accordingly, if the second House makes amendment to the bill, then the bill, as amended by the second House, must be sent back to the first House for the first House to vote on those amendments. In the first House, we don't go through all of these stages again. Instead, the members of the first House simply vote on whether to pass the bill as amended by the second House. If the first House votes to pass the bill as amended by the second House, then the bill has been passed by Parliament. If the first House votes not to pass the bill as amended by the second House, then the bill does not pass and it cannot become a law. Assuming that a bill has been passed by both the lower house and the upper house in the same form, then the last step that needs to be taken is for the Crown's representative to give royal assent to the bill. Royal assent is the approval of a bill by the Crown's representative, that is, the Governor-General, where the bill has been passed by the Commonwealth Parliament, and the Governor, where the bill has been passed by the Victorian Parliament. The Crown's representative gives this approval by signing the bill. A bill cannot come into force as a law unless the bill has first been given royal assent. Now, as a matter of practice, the Governor-General or the Governor will always give royal assent to a bill that has been passed by Parliament. So never talk about the Crown's representative refusing to give royal assent to a bill. The other point to be careful about when you are defining or describing royal assent is to make sure that you refer to royal assent as being the Crown's representative approving the bill rather than passing the bill. Parliament passes bills and the Crown's representative approves bills. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term royal assent and write this definition of royal assent in there. Once a bill has received royal assent, then we refer to it as an act. In summary, a bill only becomes a law, a statute or act of Parliament, when it has been passed by both the lower house and the upper house in the Parliament, and that bill has been given royal assent by the Crown's representative. So, at the Commonwealth level, a bill will only become a law, that is a Commonwealth Act, if it is passed by both the House of Representatives and the Senate and is given royal assent by the Governor-General. And at the Victorian level, a bill will only become a law, that is, a Victorian Act, if it is passed by both the Legislative Assembly and the Legislative Council and is given royal assent by the Victorian Governor. An Act is a law that has been passed by Parliament. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term Act and write this definition in there. Finally, I reiterate that laws are made by Parliament and not by the government. The government introduces bills into Parliament, but Parliament decides whether or not to pass those bills. We now come to the second part of this video, which is about the roles of the Houses of Parliament and the Crown in lawmaking. So your second learning intention is that you need to be able to explain the roles of the Houses of the Commonwealth and Victorian Parliaments and of the Crown in lawmaking. Make sure that you write this learning intention in your Cornell notes. Once we've been through this section of the video, please read the pages from the textbook referred to on this slide. And if you find any additional information in that reading that you think is useful, then include that additional information in your Cornell notes. The main role of the Commonwealth Parliament and the Victorian Parliament in lawmaking is to make laws by passing bills. A bill is a proposed law. There are two types of bills. The first type of bill is a government bill. A government bill is a bill that is introduced into Parliament by a government minister. Most bills are government bills. This is because the government controls the lower house of Parliament, the House of Representatives in the Commonwealth Parliament or the Legislative Assembly in the Victorian Parliament. And so a bill will only be passed by Parliament if the bill has the support of the government. The second type of bill is a private member's bill. A private member's bill is a bill introduced into Parliament by a member of Parliament who is not a government minister. Any member of Parliament is entitled to introduce a bill into Parliament, and this does happen, particularly in the upper house. However, unless the private member's bill is supported by the government, it will not be passed by the lower house, which is controlled by the government. Members of Parliament tend to introduce private members' bills where they want to put pressure on the government to support a particular change to the law by putting forward a proposed new law that will be debated in Parliament. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheet, find the terms bill, Government Bill and Private Members Bill and write these definitions in there. Now let's look in more detail at the roles of each of the lower house and the upper house in lawmaking. We'll start off with the role of the lower house in lawmaking, that is, the role of the House of Representatives in the Commonwealth Parliament and the Legislative Assembly in the Victorian Parliament. The role of the lower house in lawmaking is to initiate, that is, introduce and pass bills. This role is the result of the government being the party or coalition of parties that has the highest number of elected members in the lower house. As we've seen, the Commonwealth Government is the party or coalition of parties that has the highest number of elected members in the House of Representatives. And the Victorian Government is the party or coalition of parties that has the highest number of elected members in the Legislative Assembly. This is the reason the lower house in each of the Commonwealth and Victorian parliaments is sometimes called the House of Government. This is because the party or coalition of parties that has the highest number of elected members in the lower house forms the government. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheet, find the term House of Government and write this definition in there. It is because the government controls the lower house that most bills are initiated, that is, introduced, in the lower house, as the government has the votes necessary to ensure that the lower house passes those bills. We'll now turn to the roles of the upper house in lawmaking, that is, the roles of the Senate in the Commonwealth Parliament and the Legislative Council in the Victorian Parliament. There are three roles of the upper house in lawmaking. The first role is to act as a house of review. This means that the upper house must decide whether to pass, amend or reject, that is, review, bills that have been passed by the lower house. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheet, find the term House of Review and write this definition in there. So it is that the Senate reviews bills passed by the House of Representatives and the Legislative Council reviews bills passed by the Legislative Assembly. When you are describing this role, make sure you explain that review means decides whether to pass, amend or reject. The second role of the upper house in lawmaking follows on from the role of the upper house as a house of review. Both the Senate and the Legislative Council have a number of committees made up of a small number of members of the upper house from different parties, which are tasked with the job of reviewing bills and making recommendations as to whether the upper house should pass, amend or reject those bills. While the upper house does not have to follow these recommendations, the committee process is an important part of reviewing bills that have been passed by the lower house. The third role of the upper house in lawmaking is to initiate, that is, introduce and pass bills. Like the lower house, the upper house can also initiate and pass bills, although it is far more common for the lower house to initiate a bill because the government controls the lower house and so can be sure that the bill will at least be passed by the lower house. The exception is that the Senate cannot initiate money bills, that is, bills that impose taxes or authorise the expenditure of money. Instead, money bills can only be initiated in the House of Representatives. This brings us to the role of the Crown in lawmaking, that is, the role of the Governor-General at the Commonwealth level and the role of the Governor at the state level, the Victorian level. As we've already seen, the role of the Crown in lawmaking is to give royal assent to bills that have been passed by Parliament. Royal assent is the approval of a bill by the Crown's representative, and a law does not come into force until it has been given royal assent. The Governor-General is responsible for giving royal assent to bills passed by the Commonwealth Parliament, that is, Commonwealth bills, and the Victorian Governor is responsible for giving royal assent to bills passed by the Victorian Parliament, that is, Victorian bills. We now come to the third and final part of this video, which is about how the composition of the Houses of Parliament can affect the ability of Parliament to make law. So your third learning intention is that you need to be able to explain how the composition of the Houses of Parliament can affect the ability of Parliament to make law. Make sure that you write this learning intention in your Cornell notes. On this slide, I've set out the composition or makeup of the lower house of the Commonwealth Parliament, that is, the House of Representatives, following the federal election on the 3rd of May 2025. You can see that the Australian Labor Party has 94 of the 150 seats, which is well over half the seats. The Liberal National Party coalition has 43 seats and the crossbenchers have the remaining 13 seats. The Australian Labor Party is the Commonwealth government because it has the highest number of elected members in the House of Representatives. And it is usually the case, as here, that the government actually holds the majority of the seats in the lower house. The significance of this for lawmaking by Parliament is that where the government controls the lower house, which, as I've said, is the usual position, then it can ensure that government bills are passed by the lower house. However, there have been a few occasions when a government has not controlled the lower house. For example, from 2010 to 2012, when the Australian Labor Party was the Commonwealth government under Prime Minister Julia Gillard, the government had to rely on votes from the Australian Greens to have its bills passed by the House of Representatives. Similarly, from late 2018 up to the federal election in May 2019, when the Liberal National Party coalition was the government under Prime Minister Scott Morrison, the government ceased to hold the majority of seats in the House of Representatives as a result of some of its members leaving Parliament altogether or resigning from the Liberal National Party coalition and becoming members of the crossbench. This situation is referred to as a minority government. A minority government is a government that does not hold a majority of seats in the lower house, but instead has to rely on the support of the crossbench to pass government bills through the lower house. Where there is a minority government, we describe the parliament as being a hung parliament. That is, a parliament in which no party holds a majority of seats in the lower house. Note that the terms minority government and hung parliament are only used in the context of the lower house, not in the context of the upper house. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the terms minority government and hung parliament, and write these definitions in there. On this slide, I've set out the composition of the lower house of the Victorian Parliament, that is, the Legislative Assembly, as at 8 July 2025. You can analyse the effect of this composition on the ability of the Victorian Parliament to make law in a similar way to the analysis we have just done for the Commonwealth Parliament. On this slide, I will explain the three possible scenarios for the composition or makeup of the upper house. This could be the Senate in the Commonwealth Parliament or the Legislative Council in the Victorian Parliament. The first scenario is where the upper house is controlled by the government. That is, it's controlled by the party that has the majority of seats in the lower house. Where the upper house is controlled by the government, then there's the possibility that the upper house might act as a rubber stamp. This means that the upper house simply passes bills that have already been passed by the lower house without properly considering those bills. This is made possible because the government controls the majority in the upper house, so it can use that majority to pass government bills, that is, bills that have been passed by the government-controlled lower house, without the upper house properly considering those bills. The significance of this for lawmaking by Parliament is that in this scenario, the upper house is not acting as an effective house of review. Now, I want to stress here that simply because the government controls the upper house doesn't mean that the upper house will always act as a rubber stamp. On the contrary, the upper house might properly consider bills before passing them. However, where the upper house is controlled by the government, then there is a risk that the upper house will simply act as a rubber stamp. The second scenario is where the upper house is controlled by the opposition. Where the upper house is controlled by the opposition, then there's the possibility that the upper house might act as a hostile upper house. This means that the upper house simply rejects bills that have already been passed by the lower house without properly considering those bills. This is made possible because the opposition controls the upper house, so it can use that majority to vote down or reject government bills, that is, bills that have been passed by the government-controlled lower house without the upper house properly considering those bills. The significance of this for lawmaking by Parliament is that in this scenario, the upper house is not acting as an effective House of Review. Again, I want to stress that just because the upper house is controlled by the opposition doesn't mean that the upper house will always act as a hostile upper house. On the contrary, the upper house might properly consider bills before rejecting them. However, where the upper house is controlled by the opposition, there is a risk that the upper house will simply act as a hostile upper house. The third scenario is where the upper house is not controlled by either the government or the opposition. Under this scenario, the crossbench holds the balance of power. What this means is that the government doesn't have sufficient votes in the upper house by itself to pass bills through the upper house. If it wants to pass bills through the upper house and the opposition refuses to support those bills, then the government needs to get support for its bills from at least some of the crossbenchers. This in turn means that the government might need to negotiate changes to those bills with the crossbenchers so that they can be persuaded to vote in favour of the bills, with the result that those bills are passed by the upper house. The significance of this for lawmaking by Parliament is that in this scenario, the upper house is acting as an effective House of Review because the bills will only be passed if the government is able to persuade the crossbench that the bills are suitable laws that should be made. To the extent that any amendments agreed with the crossbench improve the operation of the bills, then the upper house will be effectively performing its role as a House of Review. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the terms rubber stamp, hostile upper house, and balance of power, and write these definitions in there. Note that the terms rubber stamp, hostile upper house, and balance of power are only used in the context of the upper house, not in the context of the lower house. On this slide, I've set out the composition or makeup of the upper house of the Commonwealth Parliament, that is the Senate, following the federal election on the 3rd of May 2025. You can see that the Australian Labor Party has 29 of the 76 seats, which is well less than half the seats. The Liberal National Party coalition has 27 seats, which is also well less than half the 76 seats. And the crossbenchers have the remaining 20 seats. To control the Senate, the government would need to hold 39 seats, but the government only holds 29 seats. Therefore, this is not a Senate that can act as a rubber stamp. To control the Senate, the federal opposition would need to hold 39 seats, but the federal opposition only holds 27 seats. Therefore, this is not a Senate that can act as a hostile Senate. The remaining 20 seats are held by the crossbenchers. This means that to get bills through the Senate where the federal opposition refuses to support them, the government needs at least 10 votes from the crossbench. This is because the government only has 29 votes but needs 39 votes, that is 10 more votes for its bills to be passed by the Senate. This is therefore a scenario where the crossbench holds the balance of power in the Senate. On this slide, I've set out the composition of the upper house of the Victorian Parliament, that is the Legislative Council, as at 8 July 2025. You can analyse the effect of this composition on the ability of the Victorian Parliament to make law in a similar way to the analysis we've just done for the Commonwealth Parliament. Well, that brings us to the end of this video. You should now be able to do three things. First, describe the process used by Parliament to make laws. Second, explain the roles of the Houses of the Commonwealth and Victorian Parliaments and of the Crown in lawmaking. And third, explain how the composition of the Houses of Parliament can affect the ability of Parliament to make law. Thank you very much for your attention.